now coming to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Harry Truman is president. The real story. What's the real story behind Truman's recognition? Truman is, of course, the great hero, recognizes the State of Israel against an onslaught from the State Department and his advisors and generals. And then on the other hand, we find documents noting his anti-Semitic leanings, and then, of course, his close friend. And what's the story, Professor Troy? How do you make sense out of all that?
So, well, let's start with the ending, which is that indeed in the early 1950s, when he finally finishes being president and he goes to the Jewish Theological Seminary and he's honored, he gets up and he says, "I am Cyrus," because just as Cyrus was the Persian emperor who returned the Jews after the first exile, he sees himself in biblical terms because his mama would read the Bible to him in Missouri as he was growing up. And he sees this story, as we've seen so many of the presidents, we've seen so many Americans, in biblical terms. So he does have a certain kind of orientation that's positive toward the Jewish story and toward the restoration and toward this Yetziat Mitzrayim, this leaving from Egypt. But indeed, as you point out, if we go through his diaries, if we speak to some of his, if we spoke to some people who knew him way back when, he peppered his speech sometimes with racial epithets and with anti-Jewish epithets. But unfortunately, that was kind of like a tick of the times. And so I don't define people by the worst moments of their lives. I don't go through the diaries with a vacuum cleaner, just trying to suck up every negative thing that's done. I try to look at somebody in context. And when I think that shortly after World War I, he goes into business with a Jewish buddy, Eddie Jacobson, and they create what's called a haberdashery, which is basically a men's clothing shop. The only time people ever use the word haberdashery is to tell this story. And he remains friends with Eddie Jacobson for many, many years, even after that haberdashery goes bust. And both of them insist on paying their bills. They don't just go into bankruptcy and say, okay, I'm walking away. They pay back every single one of their creditors over the years. I see a certain character. And that character was incredibly important, as you point out. 1947, big push, the UN recognizes, again, what do we say? Not the partition, but the right of the Jewish people to a homeland. And the date is going to be May 14th, 1948. And all of a sudden, the pressure on Truman, on David Ben-Gurion, on the Jews not to declare a state grows. And even the legendary General George Marshall, serving as Secretary of State, says, don't do it, I'll resign if you do it, because look, we have hundreds of millions of Arabs, 200 million Arabs. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Why are we going to waste American prestige on this small, not viable group of Jews who aren't going to succeed anyway? 7 Arab armies attacked the day after the day the state is declared. And Harry Truman, within 11 minutes, recognized the state of Israel. And people love to say it's because of this friendship he had with Eddie Jacobson. I hate that story because I think it reduces a multidimensional mix of both the personal, the political, and the global, the geostrategic, into simply the story of, oh, this guy went to his old friend, said, Harry, I've never asked you for anything. Please meet this wonderful man, Chaim Weizmann. That's true. But that's a small part of a bigger story where, first of all, it's 1948. What do we know about 1948? That's the same as 44, 40, 36, and 52, 56, 50. It's an election year. And Clark Clifford writes a famous memo, one of Harry Truman's key aides, saying, we need to get the Jewish vote in New York. We need the Irish vote. We need the union votes. We know all these different votes. One of the ways to get the Jewish vote is to recognize the state of Israel. So there's a political dimension as well. So there's the personal, Eddie Jacobson, and his own biblical orientation. There's the political, Clark Clifford and the 48 campaign that's looming. And there's the geopolitical. What's the most important thing after the war, beyond rebuilding America, is suddenly they go from fighting the Nazis to fighting the Soviets. Now, in 1947, both the Soviet Union and the United States of America voted to recognize the Jewish state, November 20th, 1947. But Harry Truman wants to make sure that the Jewish state, they didn't even know what they were going to call it, is going to be within the American orbit, within the democratic orbit, within the Western orbit. And so for that mix of political, personal, and geopolitical, He recognized the state of Israel within the 11 minutes, but it also took a lot of character. It took, because for him to defy George Marshall of all people, and lo and behold, guess what happened? Marshall didn't resign. We often see that people like to threaten to resign, but they don't really like to give up their limousines or, in Israel, their Volvos.